Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today I'm doing Feature History's Texas Revolution. I had somebody reach out to me about the page yesterday and asked essentially for Texas perspective of different conflicts, specifically about the Civil War video that I had done of Oversimplified. So I thought that going forward, I would try to, being from Texas and studying Texas history quite a bit, put here and there in the videos what major events, outcomes, people, or resources Texas put into a conflict. And so, starting that, I figured I would start with the Texas Revolution. So, here we go.
This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Howdy partner, and welcome to Feature History, featuring the Texas Revolution, a time back when the US liked illegal border crossing. Edgy humor aside, that time was back in the early 19th century. The area today known as Texas was a part of Mexico. The US had yet adopted Manifest Destiny, and the frontier was very much alive. Today things are different. No shit, but this video is going to delve into how much change the Texas Revolution made, just how revolutionary it was. But I won't spoil you and start our story there. We're starting with European colonization. Roll the slide. Europe first began colonizing the continent of America in the 15th century. Unless you count the Norse, but I'm not going to. Colonization would not be a walk in the park. The British, French, and Spanish all found themselves struggling against the natives, the elements, and each other in their attempts to colonize the New World. Deep within this New World was Texas. Spain and France would both claim the region, but the French would be the first to settle it in the 17th century. But then everyone died, so the fertile plains of Texas were untapped. Spain would follow up the French attempt and, through much struggle and even more stubbornness, saw limited success by the 18th century. Settled, yes, but it was the least populated area of New Spain, with between only a few hundred to a few thousand settlers. After the 7 Years' War, France would relinquish its claim to Texas and French Louisiana to Spain. But then in 1799, Spain gave Louisiana back, and then in 1803, the United States bought it. Now, was Texas included in these deals? Maybe, maybe not. There was disagreement as to actually how far these borders went, and so a line had to be drawn. With the US's purchase of Louisiana, the young nation doubled in size. The Republic now shared an extensive land border with the British and Spanish empires. Relations with them weren't great. The US's kick-started expansion and growing population led to the idea of Manifest Destiny, manifesting. Early proponents of the idea envisioned a continent united under their republic, a republic that stretched from sea to shining sea, a republic that didn't share with the old European powers.
This is something that Mexico will actually take advantage of once it gains its independence from Spain. Mexico is having trouble colonizing Texas originally, and so they kind of use the idea of Manifest Destiny of like, hey, there's land, they gave reprieves and taxes for 7 years and allowed essentially just a completely open border for colonization to try to gain some sort of tax revenue from this massive landmass that up to that point basically did nothing for Mexico.
Spain felt the pressure from the US, especially given the discrepancies in the Louisiana Purchase. The US believed itself entitled to lands as far as the Rio Grande, and soon Spain's territory was being infringed upon by American filibusters. That isn't filibuster in a political sense, but a military one. Filibusters were armed men that took to the frontier to seize land from nations that the US was technically at peace with. But all this was a very minor problem compared to what happened in 1808, as back in Europe, Spain was invaded by Napoleon, and after that, much of New Spain began to push, and even fight for independence. Mexico would break out in revolt and quickly descend into chaos. During this conflict, a Mexican-American filibuster expedition would claim Texas, declaring it as the independent Green Flag Republic, but Spanish forces would soon offer the rebels no quarter and tear down that flag. Texas was firmly in Spain's hands. However, in this rapidly deteriorating situation, Spain sought compromise and agreed to define a common border with the US. It would not surrender Texas, instead, it would cede Florida in the Transcontinental Treaty signed February 1819. Stability was finally achieved between Spain and the US, but Spain wouldn't stick around. The empire's colony fell apart and gave way to many independent Latin republics. Under the Constitution of 1824, Texas now belonged to the Federal Republic of Mexico. As the dust settled on Mexico, the threat of filibustering persisted, and so the new government under the presidency of Guadalupe Victoria sought to address the issue with the General Colonization Law of 1824. It would introduce the empresario system that sought to turn American filibusters into Mexican citizens. Empresarios, on the behalf of the Mexican government, would be recruited to sell Texan land to immigrants at low prices, and the empresarios themselves were paid in land. The population of Texas, which had sat at 3,500, exploded as the empresarios established their settlements all over. The many new immigrants to Texas, or Texians as they became known, quickly outnumbered Tejanos, Mexican-born residents.
Something interesting about this time period is because Mexico is trying to colonize Texas, and because Texas is such a harsh environment, they have to do all of these things and put all of these things into place to make it kind of like a better deal for people that would be going down to colonize. So, like I said, they got a reprieve for 7 years from taxes, but also Mexico had a law against slavery at this time, and this is pre-Civil War in the US. So that kind of puts a little bit of a wedge here between who exactly is going to be colonizing. Because if it's Southerners, they will probably have slaves. And so Mexico also puts in this kind of decree where it's not legal to own slaves, but if people colonizing Texas bring their slaves with them, they are able to use that unpaid labor. And so there's a lot of kind of nuance in what's going on here between not just race, but religion, with conversion to Catholicism, and kind of the societal system that sets up in Texas between what is essentially American colonizers, Native Americans, and then former Spanish and Mexican people. It's kind of a very interesting melting pot initially.
The immigrants were offered their citizenship as long as they learned Spanish and converted to Catholicism.
Yeah.
But it was very typical they didn't. In fact, even with promoted immigration, many Texians were illegal. America wouldn't be sending its best either. Many of those flooding Texas were outcasts. Even the most famous Texians had their foibles. Jim Bowie was a violent frontiersman, Sam Houston a disgraced politician, William Travis an indebted lawyer, and even Davy Crockett arrived to Texas off the tail end of a disappointing political career. But as it turned out, even with all its flaws, the Mexican government was now finally turning a profit off Texas, the new frontier. A turning point would, however, arise in 1826, when the empresario Hayden Edwards declared his settlement independent. Other empresarios were having none of it. They didn't wish to ruin a good thing, so Edwards' rebellion would be put down with ease. But now empresarios were starting to get a bad rap. Things only got worse. In 1829, the Mexican government abolished slavery. Many Texians were slave owners and bordered on revolt until the Mexican government allowed them some exceptions. So clearly, Texas was trouble. And so the US twice offered to take it off Mexico's hands, to which President Victoria declined. Twice.
Yeah, remember, the U.S. has been trying to get its hands on Texas ever since the Louisiana Purchase. And so, yeah, kind of hilariously, in a historical perspective, they're like, hey, if you're having all these issues and you're having trouble making money, and you have these empresarios trying to gain independence, we would be more than happy to take that off of your hands for you. It's kind of funny, and Mexico was not impressed. They were like, no, we'll figure it out.
Twice. Victoria ended his term in March 1829, and after him Mexico suffered a myriad of coups and rebellions, usually as a result of conflict between those desiring a strong centralized Mexico or a federal republic similar to that of the US. During this time of flux, it was decided within the government Texians had to be stopped. The laws of April 6, 1830 were introduced, banning any further American immigration and raising import tariffs. Texas was pissed.
Yep.
Jumping back for a moment, the aforementioned flux of power would finally settle in 1833, when the soldier and politician Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was elected president.
Elected president, he essentially ran for president for the opposition of what he was actually going to be once he got into office. Imagine somebody running for president of the United States under like a Reform Party banner, where you're like, all right, we're getting corruption out. Everybody that's been here, we're introducing term limits, and just this on and on and on list of how we're going to totally reform all these different things. And then immediately once you get in there, you put in laws that say that once you're elected into Congress or Senate, you're there for life. Everybody stays. Corruption's worse. You're the worst, most corrupt politician out of everybody. That's kind of what Santa Anna does here. He runs on a platform that is polar opposite to what he will be, which is a dictator once he gets in.
He won his election off his support for federalism, and then in 1834 completely swapped sides when he ordered the disarmament of all civic militias, dissolved Congress, and in 1835 repealed the Mexican Constitution. Santa Anna was a dictator. Much of Mexico would openly rebel against him, and he was ruthless in his suppression. In May of 1835 he would crush the militia in Zacatecas and allow his army to pillage, loot, and rape for 2 days. He gained his reputation quickly, and soon Texians were not very fond of him. Military commanders in Texas feared Texians joining the revolts, and so, maybe counterintuitively, began to crack down. In September 1835, the military was ordered to retake a cannon they had given to the militia in Gonzales. When the residents of Gonzales learned of the Mexican military's intentions, they had only one response.
This goes all the way back to the Spartans at Thermopylae, Molon Labe. That is the response at Gonzales from the Texans there. And I believe, if I remember correctly, they only have to fire the cannon once. There isn't really much of a battle. The guys that were sent in to go get it were not anticipating confrontation. And so when there not only was confrontation, but they planned on using the cannon, they were like, nah, y'all can have it. We'll figure this out later.
When Mexican forces arrived in Gonzales, they found the militia armed with firearms, the cannon, and a banner that read, "Come and take it." Significantly outnumbered, the soldiers were routed with one shot of the cannon. One shot that won the battle. One shot that started the revolution. After this, the Texians would quickly hurry to assemble a provisional government, and it was decided Sam Houston would lead as Major General of the new Texian army. That army would be responsible for running the Mexican garrison out of Texas, and with their series of victorious skirmishes, they were able to recruit many more Texians, Tejanos, and volunteers from the US and even Europe. In its lifetime, the army would amass almost 4,000 troops. Even with that, it was dwarfed by the might of the Mexican Republic. Santa Anna would take personal command of an army of 6,500 men to quickly and decisively crush the revolt. With limited time before the Mexican army's arrival, the Texians began to entrench. Colonel Jim Bowie, Colonel William Travis, and the frontiersman Davy Crockett would set up their men at an old Spanish mission-turned-military base, the Alamo. Major General Houston was well aware the Alamo couldn't hold out against a siege, but Bowie reckoned to allow the fort's capture would be detrimental, and so the Alamo remained garrisoned.
Yeah, so the Alamo is something that still stands today. I've been there a whole handful of times. It's a pretty cool place to see in person. But yeah, they are hosting a very small garrison force at the Alamo, very small in comparison to any other force in this war. The Mexicans force, or even the other Texan force. This is a very small garrison force, and so they want to hold out. And William Travis asked for help a lot when the Mexicans are arriving there, or when the Mexican army is arriving there, but they don't get word back. The Alamo ends up falling, and even though there was a fight put up and a good fight, it's kind of like a heroic last stand sort of thing in Texas history. But it ends up being very much kind of like the idea of Thermopylae with the Spartans, where it wasn't, the significance of it wasn't in how many people were killed or anything like that. It was almost the symbolic nature of what had happened. That it was a small force standing up to a huge army, that they were fighting for independence, that they wouldn't lay down their arms, and also that no quarter was given by the Mexican army. That was kind of one of Santa Anna's calling cards, was the red flag, the no quarter. And so it becomes this huge mythical symbolic thing in the Texas Revolution.
Santa Anna and 1,800 experienced soldiers met the Alamo in late February 1836. The defenders numbered only a couple hundred, and Santa Anna made his intentions clear when he rose a red flag against the fort. He would offer no quarter. The siege began immediately with a constant barrage of artillery fire. Jim Bowie would be bedridden with disease, and so command in this trying time was left in the hands of young William Travis. Travis would smuggle letter after letter urging for reinforcements, but there was little in the way of response. On March 2nd, in Washington on Brazos, the Republic of Texas would formally declare its independence. But on March 6th, back at the Alamo, the walls would be stormed. With both an advantage in numbers and experience, the Mexican army soon broke through the defenses. Travis died almost instantly, Jim Bowie would be shot dead in his bed, and David Crockett captured and executed. Survivors were few and far between. The Alamo was a slaughter. Santa Anna had learned this way of war back when he was a lieutenant fighting the Green Flag Republic, and he believed it would work again, that it would crush Texas. Santa Anna's terror continued. In the very same month, 425 prisoners were rounded up after the Battle of Goliad and massacred, piled up, and burned.
That's another thing that built up very big in the minds of Texans. The Alamo and Gilead are huge things that happen that swing the course of public sentiment in Texas towards independence.
Santa Anna believed this way of war would crush the Texian spirit, but instead the now Commander-in-Chief, Sam Houston, used these losses to uplift it. With the cry of "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad," he managed to amass many men to join the cause of the revolution, even as it seemed to be in its death throes. Mexican forces continued to move further and further into Texas as the population fled from it. It was very much a time of retreat for the Texians, and so the Mexicans became accustomed to little resistance. On the 21st of April, that Mexican army was suddenly ambushed. Sam Houston surprised Santa Anna's forces with roughly 900 men of his own, and in a battle that lasted only 18 minutes, he was able to rout the Mexican forces. That rout turned into a full-blown retreat. Many Mexican soldiers would attempt to surrender to the Texians to no avail. Repeating the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad," the Texians took to murder.
Yeah, San Jacinto is like an exorcist, almost like an exorcist. They are exorcising the demons of the Alamo, of Gilead, and they are this is kind of a revenge killing on a mass scale, and that's exactly what they did. They went in and straight up killed everybody, and the only person that more or less doesn't surrender, but goes and hides, and then eventually surrenders, is the Mexican president, dictator Santa Anna. And the only reason that he isn't killed along with everybody else is because he's the one that can give independence to Texas. As the Mexican dictator, he can formally recognize Texas as an independent country. That's why they allow him to leave.
650 Mexicans died compared to only 11 Texans. Santa Anna himself was found hiding in the marsh and was captured by the Texan army. And as much as they wanted to execute him, it was far more advantageous to have the President of the Mexican Republic as their prisoner. The remainder of the Mexican forces dared not to move from the Texans while they held Santa Anna, and so the President entered negotiations. For 3 weeks he was held and made to sign off the treaties of Velasco on May 14, 1836. The Mexican army would withdraw south of the Rio Grande and respect the border, but keep in mind, not actually recognize it. After signing this, Santa Anna would safely sail off back to Mexico City. With one decisive victory, the Texan army had achieved the unlikely. They had won their independence. But what was even more unlikely was them being able to keep it. Before the end of the war, the provisional government had convened and drawn up a constitution for their nation. One that almost copy and pasted the US Constitution, just with more revolt and slavery sprinkled in. It was clear that the leaders of the Republic wished to join the Union. However, annexation isn't just said and done. Mexico didn't recognize Texas as independent, and much of the US was torn on whether to actually annex the country. So Texas, the Lone Star Republic, existed in limbo for almost a decade. Sam Houston served as president for the Republic until in 1845, the United States would officially annex the 28th state of Texas. Of course, Mexico didn't like that, but that's a story for another time.
Yeah, and not only did they not like that and it led to the Mexican-American War, Sam Houston, who was the president of the Republic of Texas, then becomes the governor of Texas. He will actually be governor of Texas until the secession of Texas for the Civil War. And he is actually removed from office. I'll get into this more on the second part of the Civil War video, but he's actually removed from office because he does not agree with secession. And so, because Texas is such a vital part of the Confederate strategy and hope of winning a war, and public sentiment around the idea of secession, he is then removed, a new governor is put in place, and Texas succeeds and becomes part of the Confederacy. Sam Houston kind of has a troubled last bit of his life, not wanting to secede and not living to see Texas become back a part of the Union.
As it stood, American expansion had just begun. The seeds of the Union's problems had been planted, and an era of US dominance just beginning. However, it must be said that this episode of history contains a lot more than I had time to go over, or that I even could go over. History isn't just a story of war and politics, but also of concepts like math, science, and physics. Now, admittedly, I've never been the strongest in these fields, but with Brilliant, the tools to learn these...
Alright, that was Feature History's Texas Revolution. Like, comment, subscribe. Keep helping me build a channel over here, and I will see you guys next time.